United States is the most militarily powerful state in the world. It has maintained global dominance as an imperial power through a neo-colonial system of sub-fascist client states, which aim to represent US interests abroad by creating a favourable investment climate for multinational corporations. The categorization of sub-fascist is used because, unlike fascist regimes in Europe, such as those of Hitler and Mussolini, US client states maintain the authoritarian characteristics of fascism, but without any popular base of support that existed to an extent in European fascist movements. Sub-fascist states can more or less be tied together with the Unifying National Security Doctrine, or NSD, in which the individual is absolutely subordinated to the state perceives its actions as being part of a constant heroic warfare against the so-called communist forces of evil, and the military leadership reserves the right to simply annihilate all forms of political opposition that threaten a reduction in privilege. The categorization of sub-fascist is also used because the NSD does not include the grotesquely distorted notions of community and so-called socialism that were found in European fascisms, thus providing elites with an ideological cover for disregarding the health and nutritional needs of the vast majority of the population, while amassing huge personal fortunes for themselves and their families. The embezzlement of public money in sub-fascist client states is explained by the US not as a result of its own role in perpetuating corruption, but through racist myths about the inherent nature of people who live in the areas where the client states are located. Neocolonial, sub-fascist client states are designed to create a favourable investment climate for multinational corporations. They enable quick decisions to be made without the inconvenience and delay of a democratic system. They lower taxation and suppress labour unions, repressing wages. Multinationals buy up the smaller local businesses and sell their products overseas to populations who can actually afford them. Inequality increases, and the majority of the populations of the client states are left to rot in disease and dreadful living conditions. US military and economic aid to client states is positively correlated with a favourable investment climate and negatively correlated with human rights and democracy. When states fail to provide a favourable investment climate, the CIA uses a number of strategies to subvert them, including outright murder of political leaders, conspiring with military personnel and terrorists, political bribery, propaganda campaigns, organising protests, infiltration of unfavourable organisations, and continuously providing client states with as much information as possible. Like the word communism, another word whose meaning has been distorted in order to serve powerful elite interests is terrorism. Most people understand terrorism to mean intimidation through systematic violence in service of political goals. In the language of US foreign policy, the categorization of an action as being terrorism or violence depends entirely on the official status and political affiliation of the individual or group carrying out the action. Terrorism is only used to describe actions which may be violent or non-violent carried out by non-state actors, especially non-state actors who are politically opposed to what the US considers to be a favourable investment climate. Terrorism is never used to describe the actions of official state actors, especially the actions of US client states. By definition, the actions of the US and its sub-fascist client states can never be categorized as terrorism, because terrorism is reserved for their opponents. Even if they are using systematic violence in order to intimidate political opponents, they are by definition always exempt from accusations of terrorism. In the language of US foreign policy, there are three kinds of bloodbaths: constructive bloodbaths, benign bloodbaths, and nefarious bloodbaths. Although it is not always clear, the categorization of a bloodbath as constructive, benign, or nefarious depends not on the actual extent of the bloodbath, but on who the perpetrators and victims are. A constructive bloodbath is a bloodbath carried out by the US and/or its sub-fascist client states against enemies which pose a threat to creating a favourable investment climate. The decades of systematic terror, political murders and exploitation endured by the Dominican working class under the iron fist of martial law, the imprisonment and torture of tens of thousands of political prisoners in the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos, the conquest of Guatemala, the massacre of at least 500,000 people in a campaign of anti-communist purges led by the Indonesian military, these are constructive bloodbaths, as they provide a paradise for American investors by wiping out all of the so-called communists. Communists meaning anyone who wants a reduction in privilege. A benign bloodbath is also a bloodbath carried out by the US and/or its sub-fascist client states, but against populations which do not necessarily pose a threat to creating a favourable investment climate, but are nonetheless considered a nuisance that ought to be taken care of. The systematic enslavement, massacre and deculturalization of Aceh Indians in Paraguay, the genocide of tens of thousands of Hutus by the minority Tutsi government in Burundi, and the extermination of hundreds of thousands of landless peasants in East Timor at the hands of the US-backed Indonesian military, these are benign bloodbaths. These aren't so much glorious crusades for freedom, they're just a bit of spring cleaning. A nefarious bloodbath is a bloodbath carried out by enemies of the US, who pose a threat to the creation of a favourable investment climate. In the eyes of the US, these bloodbaths are the only bloodbaths deserving of a moral outcry, and as they are carried out by enemies of the US, their extent can be exaggerated to comical proportions for propaganda purposes, a la Black Book of Communism. When 3,000 to 15,000 people were killed during a land reform program in North Vietnam, US sources inflated the figure to over 500,000, with the media overflowing with indignation. What's important is that the indignation towards nefarious bloodbaths is always reserved for the crimes of opponents of the United States. It is never directed towards the countless imperialist bloodbaths spearheaded by the US and its sub-fascist client states, however numerous their victims may be. As they are supported by the US, they are categorized as benign or even constructive. The bottom line is that US power never sees its own actions as being unjust, only the actions of other states. It is the most powerful state in the world, and so it reserves the unquestionable right to use violence and brutality in service of profit and corporate power, irrespective of the enormous ecological and human costs of plunder and barbarism. Any attempt to expose the crimes of the US in popular discourse will be overshadowed by the sea of legitimizing myths about so-called freedom and democracy that are churned out by the capitalist propaganda machine we call a free press. And to an anarchist, none of this is at all surprising. Thanks for listening.